I would now like to introduce our second panellist for this evening, Reverend James Bhagwan. Reverend Bhagwan is the Secretary of Communication for the Methodist Church of Fiji and Rotuma. He is also the Interim General Secretary of the Fiji Council of Churches. Reverend Bhagwan grew up in Toka until he left for New Zealand for his tertiary education. He was one of the earliest faces of the local television sector, and behind the scenes he was part of the pioneering team which produced Fiji TV News Live. He has also worked with the Ministry for Information and the Fiji Broadcasting Corporation, mainly as a producer and scripting commercials. Reverend Bhagwan, as some of you probably know, is also a regular columnist in the Fiji Times. He joined the Pacific Theological College in 2003, from where he graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity. Reverend Bhagwan will speak on the question, does faith still have a role in social changes towards a developed nation? Please welcome James.
Good evening, friends. It is a privilege to share this space with the other honored guests and speakers tonight. I think I have the most difficult presentation because I've been asked to speak on faith. And for me, that's usually something hard to do without preaching, or pounding the lectern, or keeping to a 10-minute limit, or not criticizing constitutions and things like that. Anyway, this evening I'd like to invite you to reflect with me on the role of faith communities in society, where faith communities are placed in the context of development and social change, and how this somehow fits with the theme of International Day of the Family. To frame this conversation, let me say at the outset that I will for the most be speaking on my own faith perspective as an ecumenical Christian who is a member of and serves the faith community known as Methodists. I'm also speaking as a husband, a father, a son, brother, and member of a very large and diverse extended family. The question of the role of faith communities in society is a very interesting one to ask as we enter the second decade of the 21st century. The early sociologists, such as Marx, thought of the religion as the opiate of the people, opiate of the masses. And there were many conclusions very early on that religion in modern society would be declining in significance. And it would seem, particularly from a functional perspective, that while the location and manifestation of religion has changed in contemporary society, this is more of a transformation rather than decline in religion. As many of you know, faith and formal religion have both positive and negative social functions. Religion can support dysfunctions. It can force social integration. It can support aggressive attitudes and criminal behavior, forced conversion, desecration of places of worship from a different faith. It can also foster social conflict, whether in response to radical secular ideology, which is perceived as a threat to social cohesion and control, or as a result of fundamentalist religious attitudes. In fact, religion has contributed to some of the world's greatest atrocities and human rights abuses. However, from a positive perspective, religion reinforces social unity and stability in at least two ways. First, it gives a common set of beliefs, and thus is an important agent of social cohesion. And secondly, the communal practice of religion, as in houses of worship, brings together people physically. It facilitates their communication and social interaction and strengthens their social bonds. Religion in that sense is an agent of social control and thus strengthens the social order. Religion also teaches moral behavior and so helps them to learn to be good members of society. From my perspective, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Ten Commandments are perhaps the most famous set of rules for moral behavior, while Jesus' Sermon on the Mount can also be understood as a manifesto for social cohesion and control. Religion can also motivate people to work for positive social change. can look at many religions, but from the Christian perspective, it has played a central role in development of the civil rights and social justice movements, liberation theology, and opposition to economic globalization. I was reading last week of how the people who were involved in the setting up of the World Council of Churches in 1948 were also involved in some of the aspects of the drafting of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So it's affirming some of these things. Faith communities have increasingly had to share the public space with government, NGOs and CSOs, and lately globalized capitalism and the global commercial media. And I don't mean the news media, I'm talking about the broader sense of the media. And so we find the space not just our own. In many developed or modern nations, the decrease in traditional church religions may be seen as a consequence of the shrinking relevance of values institutionalized in religion or in the church for the integration and legitimation of everyday life in modern society. However, I feel that the landscape in Fiji and the Pacific is different. Back in 2010, the Commission on AIDS in the Pacific acknowledged that without the involvement of religious communities, the responses to HIV in the Pacific would not have been as strong as they had been. The UNAIDS regional director at that time, Steve Krause, Director for Asia and Pacific, said, and I quote, "Within the theological bounds of their various faiths, the churches, mosques and temples have been and continue to be the prominent in driving HIV responses in the region as powerful players in Pacific communities." This statement captures the essence of the influence of faith communities in our society. And now, while our own history in Fiji records both negative and positive influences on social change in the past, faith communities provide a space in which the discourse on social change can take place. You know, Fijian society is complex because it straddles so many different stages of social development. We still have the pre-modern culture, modern society, and those moving into post-modernity. And this makes for a very complex society. Leads to clash of cultures, clash of ideologies within our society, as though still struggling to reconcile traditional values and social structures within the 20th century have also to face the 21st century, in which the globalized capitalist system is determining how our societies operate today. The reality is that for the most, faith communities have been passive spectators to rapid social change caused by globalization. The Third Pacific Island Mission Conference in 2010 issued a statement which acknowledged that some of the elements of conservative theologies do not give the capacity to address the critical issues facing our communities. Rather, they adversely impact in our gender relations, our ability to dignify the other, our ability to analyze and address the factors creating the divisions of the poor and wealthy in our communities, and our part in the destructive exploitation of the environment. But we're catching up since then. It's important that the church and faith communities speak to the issues of development, speak to issues to ensure that the marginalized and the vulnerable are considered in all decision making when it comes to development. That it's balanced development, not just economic but also socio-political. That economic growth is community driven. That people are seen as community in the Pacific and not just as commodities, not just as producers or consumers. That there is equity in development. What is developed and for whom is it developed for? And that we take due consideration to the environment. In a Christian perspective, we are called to be stewards of the environment, to take care of this gift that God has entrusted us with. Our faith societies and faith communities speaking to these things. It's interesting that we often rely on extended family situations, and although we are slowly moving with the time, or whatever the situation is, towards nuclear families, you know, mother, father and 2.5 kids, single parents, we have also situations in which parents are not raising their children and grandparents are left to do so. So we live in dysfunctional families. And perhaps faith communities also function as dysfunctional families. But faith communities provide the space for extensions of the family. They provide a very important social netting to ensure that even if there are cracks within society, no one is left behind. We are strands in this net. And faith communities provide an opportunity for those strands to be woven together, to ensure human dignity, to ensure that we see the image of God in the stranger, that we look at stewardship of resources, of wealth and the environment, and that we're inclusive. There is a term called ecumenical, and I know my friend Takape, who is a young ecumenist, is sitting with us this evening. And the term ecumenical is about the search for visible unity amongst the churches. And if you extend that from the Greek, it comes from oikos. Oikos refers to the whole inhabited earth. The understanding that we all belong to one family, the human family. The work of the churches and faith communities in Fiji and the Pacific resulted some time ago in the vision of the island of hope, where life is significant, valued and celebrated. There is a celebration of life over material wealth. Hope is in tune with nature by sharing and caring, to which people want to journey in order to celebrate life in its fullness. This is something that the faith communities can contribute to help people envision this community and encourage people to bring this community to reality. Ratachane mentioned the role of strengthening. And I think the faith communities have an important role in their various aspects to strengthen the values in community, but also to remind us that we are called to look out for the vulnerable in society, to ensure that no one is left behind, and that in the global village and in development, there are not people still sitting outside the Naka.